Hey there, I wanted to show you a few tricks for working with the new Morph transition available in PowerPoint in Office 365. So this is a new transition that you might have seen appear on your Transitions tab. It's kind of towards the very beginning of the list these days. So a little bit about this transition, and some people discover this and try to work with it and get a little bit frustrated. So I wanted to show you a few tricks of working with this. So I've got a slide here in a presentation, and so what happens is some people go in here and say, all right, I'm going to test out this new Morph transition. They select that transition from the Transitions tab, and seeing the preview of that is not all that stunning. Let's look at that again. Doesn't look like much of anything. Kind of looks like fade, actually. So what happens with Morph, and there's kind of a trick to setting this up, and if you ever forget it, if you just hover your mouse right over that transition name, it actually gives you some really helpful instructions. So it's telling us to, for best results, to duplicate this slide, move some things around, and then apply the Morph transition. So let's just see what they mean by this. So I'm going to take this college's slide, I'm going to follow those directions, I'm going to right click on top of this slide and duplicate. So now I've got two identical slides. So for the sake of this, I'm just going to pretend maybe today's discussion is only going to be half of these colleges. So I'm going to go up here and just change the title here, today's discussion. And this is Smart Art. If you're interested in learning more about that, we do cover this in PowerPoint Essentials. And I'm not being biased, I'm just going to delete every other college here just to make a little change to this slide, just so there's something different between the two. Okay, so we're just going to talk about 4 colleges today, we'll say. So I have two slides, a little bit different, and because I had already applied the Morph transition, that's actually, when I duplicated the slide, that brought that Morph transition with it, so handy. I'm going to preview this slide and see what happens. A little bit more like what we had in mind, right? When you think of Morph, you think of something like this. So the real key with Morph, and the reason these instructions are like this, is because the idea is you have 2 very similar slides with just a few variations. If that's the case, and this is the best way to create that situation, duplicating a slide, moving things around, and then applying the transition. So yeah, as long as that's the case, it will morph pretty successfully, and that's a great way to ensure that that works. So let me show you one more thing here, and that is, so some people will say, all right, I figured that out. I'm going to do that on this slide, this Wichita fact slide, which don't quote me on any of these statistics here. These are all probably pretty out of date. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to say, all right, I want to do the same thing to this slide. So I know what I'm doing. I'm going to right click on top of this slide. I'm going to duplicate it. So I have 2 identical slides, and same story. I'm going to say, for today's discussion, we're only going to talk about every other item in this list. So Wichita Facts, today's discussion, and I'm going to delete every other bullet point. This is just text. This is not Smart Art like before. It's going to behave a little bit differently. So, okay, I feel pretty good about this, and I know I need to apply the Morph transition to my second slide. And this is where people get a little frustrated. They say, well, I thought I followed all these instructions exactly. I duplicated the slide, I moved things around, I applied the Morph transition. Previewing that, it looks just like I didn't do anything. So the key to this, and we do cover this more in Essentials, whenever you're working with a transition or an animation, if you're wishing for a little bit more, or look to the right, you have some effect options here, and they're different depending on which transition you've selected, really. So in the Morph transition, the case of the Morph transition, the default effect option is objects. So this worked really well with Smart Art, with shapes, it's going to default really well. When you're working with text, you probably want one of these other 2 options, words or characters. So let's check out words. Pretty cool. Let's look at that again. Like that. But my favorite one under effect options, this is my total favorite, new favorite transition, the characters setting in the Morph transition. I just love that. I think that looks so modern, so interesting. It just adds something interesting to your presentation. So something to think about. when you're working with text is checking out these effect options if it's not working exactly like you're wanting it to. There's some other cool stuff you can do with even just with the object setting of Morph. So for instance, so let's say I want to have a slide about weather alerts and how we alert people of weather issues when they're at WSU. So I'm going to do that same thing. Maybe I want this cloud to move in front of the sun. Well, the morph transition is going to be a great way to create this animation. So let's do that. I'm going to right click on weather alerts, duplicate this slide. So I have 2 duplicate slides here. If I want my second slide, my first slide to morph into my second slide with the cloud being on top of the sun, all I need to do is move that cloud on top of the sun on my second slide, apply that morph transition. So that's pretty cool by itself. Very similar, by the way, to a certain type of animation you may have worked with before called motion paths, right? So some people play with these a little bit. But here's the cool thing about working with the morph transition as opposed to the motion paths. I can kind of do a lot more. So what if I want the cloud to get bigger? That was a little intense, but I want it to totally cover up the sun. See what that looks like. Even more stunning. Or what about if I want the background to mimic kind of a stormy gray background, right? So, and we covered this in PowerPoint Advanced, but when you right click in the center of a slide, I have an option to format the background. Picking from a variety of colors, I'm going to just grab just something a little bit darker gray. It's funny how something that doesn't look very dark in this tiny little swatch view, when you apply it to a whole slide, can look a lot darker. So let's see what that looks like. Pretty cool. So you can get pretty creative with this. The real key is to follow these really helpful instructions when you kind of hover over that morph transition. Duplicate your slide, move things around, and even changing the size or the shape of a shape, and then applying the morph transition. Don't forget about effect options to the right. If you're working with words especially, check out the characters option. I think it's really cool. So I hope that was helpful. I know this is quick. We cover this in more detail in the PowerPoint Advanced session if you're interested in checking that out.